Revelle Balmain was a highly regarded name in the Australian entertainment industry in the late 1990s. Revelle was 22 years old, a model, and a dancer. She had already gained some experience, had performed, and been booked for photo shoots. In mid-November 1994, the moment Revelle had been working toward was supposed to happen. Her first major magazine cover. Bright Lights, Big City is the title of Oyster magazine, on whose cover the young woman appears. But Revelle herself will never hold a copy of this magazine in her hands. Instead, she disappears amid the bright lights of the big city that the magazine talks about. To this day, the model remains missing. And to this day, there are concrete suspects, at least one of whom has a dark secret. November 1994 is set to be the most important month of Revelle Balmain's career, perhaps even of her life. It's the month when everything has come together. In the middle of the month, the Australian will appear on the cover of Oyster magazine. During the same period, she will travel from Sydney to Brisbane to take part in dance rehearsals with her new ensemble. And right after that, Revelle will head to Japan. She has landed a 6-month contract as a dancer there. For Revelle, this is obviously a fantastic opportunity and really exciting. But there is also an incredible amount to organize. The 22-year-old lives with a friend in Bellevue Hill, a suburb of Sydney, right on the harbour. She got together with her boyfriend, writer Pierce Fisher Pollard, just a few weeks ago. And now Revelle's career is really taking off, even if that does require some sacrifices. With the 6-month engagement in Japan on the horizon, Revelle also has some goodbyes ahead of her. She won't see her boyfriend, her sister, her mom, or all these other people for half a year. That's exactly why Revelle made plans with her mother for November 6, 1994. The two agreed that Revelle would take the 9:30 a.m. train from Sydney to Newcastle. The train would arrive around 11 a.m., and her mother could meet her there. That way, the two would at least have one last day together before Revelle left for Asia. But Revelle will never board the train to Newcastle on November 6th. She probably didn't even live to see that day. Jen Balmain waits in vain at the Newcastle train station that morning. First, she waits for the 11 a.m. train, then the one after that. Revelle doesn't get off any of them. At a loss, Jen drives home again. Revelle's favorite meal, which she cooked especially for her daughter's visit, remains untouched on the stove. Instead, she spends the day on the phone. She calls everyone she can think of. Revelle's roommate, her friends, even all the hospitals in Sydney. Jen calls them all. The 22-year-old is worried that something might have happened. But the answer Jen gets is always the same. No one knows anything. At the same time, Revelle's boyfriend Pierce is also very worried. He hasn't been able to reach Revelle since the night before. The two last saw each other the morning before. Revelle and Pierce had planned to spend November 5th together. But Pierce had a bad headache that day, so he stayed home. The last thing he knows is that she wanted to take a bus to Paddington around noon to meet a friend. But Revelle didn't meet any friends on November 5th. She was somewhere else entirely, in the apartment of a businessman in the Sydney suburb of Kingsford. Because Revelle had a secret that not even her mother or boyfriend knew about. Revelle not only worked as a model and dancer, but was also registered with 2 upscale escort agencies. These are companies that arrange companions, known as escorts, for social occasions in exchange for cash payment, for business dinners, events, trips, or whatever else. That is primarily what an escort is there for, to provide company, companionship, or entertainment. Whether more intimate services are included depends on the agency and the escort themselves. Escorts usually decide for themselves which jobs they accept. They are not directly employed by the agency, but are placed with clients. Revelle has only been employed by one of her two agencies, Select Companions, since the summer. She has hardly told anyone about it. That's why it's only the police, alerted by Pierce and Jen, who will find out where Revelle spent the afternoon of November 5th. On that day, Revelle called her boss at Select Companions. At the time, the agency was run by a couple named Jane and Zoran Stanojevic. Revelle told Jane that she had some free time and was available for appointments. Her boyfriend Pierce stayed home with a headache. So Revelle probably thought she could use the day productively to earn a little extra money before her trip to Japan. Select Companions immediately found someone who booked Revelle for the afternoon. A 31-year-old man named Gavin Seymour. After the appointment with Gavin, Revelle was supposed to go to two friends of her boss, Zoran. But first, she had the appointment with Gavin Seymour at 4 p.m. He lives in the Kingsford neighborhood of Sydney on McNair Avenue. Revelle visits him at his home. At 3:50 p.m., she called her boss, Jane, and said she was going in. Right on time, 2 hours later at 5:50 p.m., she called again to say that the appointment was over. According to Gavin Seymour himself, however, this was a lie. Revelle stayed for another hour without telling her agency. This meant that Revelle did not have to pay the agency for the extra hour. Instead, Gavin paid her separately in cash. At 7:15 p.m., a friend called Revelle. She just wanted to chat a little, but Revelle seemed busy. She told her friend that maybe the two of them could go out for a drink later. She said she would call back in about an hour when she got home. This tells us two things. At 7:15 p.m., Revelle was definitely still alive and did not feel immediately threatened. She apparently assumed she would be home soon. But we also know that this call was the last sign of life from Revelle. What happened after 7:15 p.m. remains a mystery to this day. Gavin Seymour reports that he dropped Revelle off at a pub called the Red Tomato Inn at around 7:30 p.m. Gavin himself then went to a small shop, bought beer and cigarettes, and drove home. According to his own statements, he fell asleep in front of the television there. However, no one can remember Revelle being in or around the Red Tomato Inn. Although it may sound superficial, Revelle is not an inconspicuous person. When she shows up somewhere, she stands out. And yet, there has not been a single sighting. The next thing found belonging to Revelle are personal items scattered around the Kingsford district of Sydney. Revelle's shoes are lying in the middle of a sidewalk. One of her platform sandals is found in a trash can, the second shoe on the street, and her diary in a raincoat. Her credit cards, handbag, and a bag of makeup also gradually turn up. The police now have lots of little pieces of the puzzle, but there is still no trace of Revelle herself. You can probably guess who the police suspect first. Gavin Seymour. When the police question him, he immediately admits that he paid Revelle for sex. And that despite the fact that he has a girlfriend. However, his girlfriend Michelle was away that weekend. That's why she doesn't know at first that Gavin pawned one of her musical instruments to pay for an escort. Michelle only finds out about this from the police. Gavin even picked her up from the airport in Sydney on November 8th. Michelle noticed some scratches on Gavin's hands and neck. She also noticed that the seats in his car had been folded back, and that the otherwise rather messy car was almost tidy, and that Gavin had changed the bedding in his apartment and washed all the bed linen. When Michelle is questioned by the police, she tells them everything without hesitation. Incidentally, she breaks up with Gavin immediately when she finds out that he cheated on her with Revelle. Not only Michelle, but also one of the police officers noticed the scratches on Gavin's hands and neck. And according to investigators, they could well be defensive wounds sustained during a fight. Gavin's house is searched by the police, but initially without result. Gavin is officially named as a suspect, but there is no evidence sufficient to press charges. And Revelle is never found. The case, therefore, becomes a cold case. It is not until 14 years later, in 2008, that there is any news. Gavin no longer lives in Sydney, but the police decide to search his former home in Kingsford. Afterward, the police announce that the search has yielded new forensic results that could represent a breakthrough in the case. Unfortunately, no details are given. It is only stated that the results are now better than those of the first search 14 years ago due to technical advances since 1994. It could be, for example, that the new technology has enabled them to find small traces of blood or other signs of a struggle in Gavin's apartment. But as I said, this is just speculation. Officially, the police have never said what was found during this search, and nothing else comes of it. Gavin remains at large to this day, even though the investigation focused heavily on him, especially in the early years. Critics of the investigation fear that the police may have become too fixated on Gavin as the possible perpetrator, and that the real perpetrator may have gotten away. There is a witness named Jeremy who made a statement to the police at the time. He is not directly involved in the case, but he knows someone who knows Revelle. Jeremy is good friends with a wealthy commodities trader named Mark Colton. Mark booked Revelle several times through Select Companion and didn't exactly keep it a secret. According to Jeremy, once when Mark and Jeremy were already quite drunk at a party, the conversation between the men turned to the subject of escorts. Mark said something along the lines of, "Aren't people gullible and stupid? You heard the story about Revelle Balmain. First there was a rumor about an Arab prince who had kidnapped her and taken her to Saudi Arabia. What nonsense. She's 6 feet under and no one will ever find her body. That's what you get for robbing the brothel she worked at, drugging the clients and stealing their money. Basically, the brothel owner wanted her dead because she was ruining his business. I knew her, and she was a nasty little gold digger and coke addict who would do anything for money. Isn't it amazing what you can do with money to make people disappear?" Jeremy then asked Mark how he knew Revelle so well. Mark replied that he had taken Revelle out of the brothel and paid her $500 to $1,000 Australian dollars a week because it was cheaper than paying $150 to $200 an hour. Mark slept with Revelle about a dozen times a week before passing her on to a friend. At this point, it should be mentioned again that Revelle did not work in a brothel. Mark was referring to the escort agency here, and his overall derogatory tone speaks volumes about his view of women. If any of this is even true. These statements were relayed by the witness Jeremy, who himself admits that he and Mark had already drunk a lot of alcohol when Mark allegedly told him all this. But Jeremy is absolutely certain that Mark told him on that night that Revelle had been rejected. And if you listened closely, you probably noticed that Mark also directly implied a perpetrator. And not the previous prime suspect, Gavin Seymour, but Revelle's boss at the escort agency, who, according to Mark's statement, Revelle had ruined the business for. Mark himself denies his statement, saying that he didn't tell Jeremy any of that. Mark admits that he was a client of both agencies where Revelle was employed at the time. She was one of 10 escorts he slept with in 1994. He also states that the story about weekly payments to Revelle is not true. Mark claims he only gave her $1,000 for a meeting because Revelle told him about her upcoming trip to Japan and he felt sorry for her. However, he also admits that there were rumors that the bosses were threatening the women they employed. He also heard that one of the agency owners wanted to beat her up a little and then went too far. For him, this was apparently not reason enough to stop using the agencies as a client. Nor was it reason enough to go to the police himself with this information after Revelle's disappearance. Although Mark himself is backtracking, the police are now taking a closer look at the former boss of Select Companions. As you may recall, the company was run at the time by Jane and Zoran Stanojevic. In an initial interview, Jane described Revelle as a rather unreliable escort. In the 6 weeks she worked for Select Companions, she simply skipped several appointments. She was very picky and only went out with men who A, she liked, and B, paid enough money. Jane is no longer active as an escort agent. And most importantly, she's no longer married to Zoran. It is thanks to Jeremy's statements and, above all, Jane's that the police investigation is moving in a different direction. Towards Zoran Stanojevic. As I told you at the beginning, Revelle agreed to meet 2 personal friends of Zoran on the evening of November 5th. The 2 men were visiting from Zoran's homeland, the former Yugoslavia. One of them is said to be called Bojan. The name of the other is not known. However, as far as we know, Revelle never showed up for this meeting with the 2 men. At the time, Jane simply blamed it on Revelle's unreliability. But now, things look different. The situation was that Revelle still owed the agency money. It was probably $300 or $400 in cash that Revelle was supposed to pass on to the agency as his share. Most customers paid by card even back then, but some paid in cash. Since Revelle was about to leave for Brisbane and Japan, Select Companions naturally wanted to get the money back. According to Jane, Zoran wanted to collect the money from Revelle in person that evening, settle the matter, and then drop her off at the meeting with his 2 friends. We know that Revelle never showed up for this meeting. However, Zoran claims that he did not pick up Revelle anywhere that evening and had no intention of doing so. Unlike his ex-wife Jane, Zoran says he knew nothing about Revelle's debts. Accordingly, he did not want to collect any money from her. When asked where he was on November 5th, 1994, Zoran has an answer ready. He says he was with his then-wife, Jane, buying a new TV for the office. The 2 spent the afternoon at home. At around 6 or 6:20 p.m., he drove to the office to set up the TV. He returned home at around 7 or 7:15 p.m. Conveniently, this was exactly the time when Revelle Balmain was last seen alive. He claims he did not work at all on that fateful Saturday evening. However, Zoran's ex-wife Jane remembers November 5th somewhat differently. She also says that Zoran left again at around 6:30 p.m., but not to take the new TV to the office, but to work. During a later review of the case, Zoran tries to talk his way out of it. He says he never said that he didn't work at all on that Saturday. The whole thing was probably mistranslated at the time. The Serbian translator who was assigned to him was apparently not very good. However, there is a recording of Zoran's statement, and an independent translator newly commissioned by the police confirms that everything is correct. Zoran clearly said that he did not work on the evening of November the 5th, 1994. When he gets carried away, he changes his statement. He now admits that he was out that evening. At around 7:15 p.m., he picked up an escort named Kelly and took her to an appointment in Double Bay. He waited for her and drove her home after the appointment. Later that evening, he drove off again to pick up Kelly and take her to his 2 friends at the Park Royal Hotel, presumably as a replacement for Revelle, who allegedly just didn't show up. Zoran waited 2 hours for Kelly at the Park Royal, then drove her to a 3rd appointment at the airport and brought her back home. It is interesting to note that his wife Jane said that the 2 Yugoslavs were waiting at the Swiss Grand Hotel in Bondi. She only changed this statement later and then also mentioned the Park Royal. Finally, according to his own statement, Zoran had a flat tire on his car on the way back, which he changed himself. In other words, Zoran was apparently very busy on the evening and night of Revelle's disappearance. You are probably wondering whether this alibi can be corroborated, perhaps by Zoran's 2 friends from Yugoslavia or the escort Kelly. Unfortunately, this lead is not pursued in the first years of the investigation, perhaps because the police are investigating Gavin Seymour and consider him a strong suspect, perhaps because the police believe Zoran at the time, and perhaps also because it is quite difficult to track down the 2 friends and Kelly. It is not until years later that the police check the hotel records for November 5th, 1994. There were no 2 Yugoslavian citizens who booked a room at the Park Royal Hotel on that day. There were also no Yugoslavian guests at the Swiss Grand, which Jane initially mentioned. Kelly can only be located at the end of the 1990s, after Jane breaks up with Zoran and passes her details on to the police. Kelly is described as hesitant, but she confirms everything Zoran has said, down to the smallest detail. From the meeting with the Yugoslav men, to the appointment at the airport, to Zoran's flat tire on the way home. However, it is striking that Kelly is only questioned years later. After Revelle's disappearance, she was not contacted to confirm Zoran's alibi directly. Instead, Zoran was apparently simply believed. At the end of 2021, detectives searched Revelle's former apartment in Bellevue Hill. They also searched a room in what was then the Bondi Hotel, now called Cutie. A third search took place in the former office of Select Companions in Potsport. No clues as to Revelle's whereabouts were found. However, there was evidence that Zoran Stanojevic belonged to a gang of thieves specializing in luxury goods. As a result, Zoran was arrested in December 2021 for various thefts. He was convicted in 2022 and spent several months in prison. He is now free again. To date, he has never been charged in connection with the crime against Revelle. However, since the searches, he has been officially considered a person of interest. In an interview published by 60 Minutes Australia in 2023, Jane provides further new information. She says that Zoran spontaneously organized a flight ticket for his friend Bojan on November 6th to leave Australia for Thailand. That was the day after Revelle's disappearance. And Bojan was one of the two men Revelle was supposed to meet that evening. This fits in with another circumstance in the case. In 2021, the Australian authorities receive a new lead. An anonymous tipster sends a photo. It shows a man wearing sunglasses. The police believe that this man may be connected to Revelle Balmain's disappearance and are still searching for him as a witness. The 60 Minutes Australia team believes that this photo shows Zoran's friend Bojan. In the report, a journalist tracks down Zoran and shows him a photo of Bojan. Unfortunately, it is unclear whether she is showing the photo that was sent as a tip in 2021 or an old photo of Bojan that somehow turned up elsewhere.
Is this your friend?
I know him, yeah.
Yes. Why did you organise for him to leave Australia the morning after Revelle disappeared? Why did you do that?
No, I have to work. I'm very sorry.
Where were you? What happened? Can you tell me?
I have to work, sorry.
But Jane doesn't come across entirely well in the 60 Minutes report either. The reason for this is her own statements, which have changed slightly over the years. Above all, there is one point that does not cast her in a good light. The morning after Revelle's disappearance, Jane went to a restaurant in Sydney. She asked the employee for an alibi, saying that she and her husband Zoran had eaten there the previous day. If the police asked, it would be great if the restaurant could confirm this. Surely the restaurant staff would do that if anyone could remember. But the employee Jane caught on the phone said he knew nothing about the visit the day before, even though he had been working that day. He then offered Jane the opportunity to come to the restaurant in person. If he recognized Jane, he could tell the police. But Jane never came. The restaurant employee still maintains that Jane spoke directly about a murder investigation that she and her husband were involved in. She insists that she was talking about a missing person report, and that she and Zoran were indeed eating there at around 5 p.m. on November 5th. Whether this is true or not is almost irrelevant. What is much more astonishing is how quickly Jane arranged an alibi. She first called the restaurant and only then the police. Jane continues to claim in the article that she has information that would exonerate Gavin Seymour. She says she knows of at least a partial alibi that was not known to the police during the initial investigation. Unfortunately, Jane does not specify where she got this alibi from or whether she shared her information with the police. She appears in the documentary using her real name and showing her face. This is despite the fact that Zoran became violent towards her at the end of their relationship, and the two have a child together. This would suggest that she is already certain of her case. But her strange behavior leaves a bitter aftertaste. Revelle's parents have sadly passed away without ever finding out what happened to their daughter. Even 30 years after Revelle's disappearance, her older sister continues to work tirelessly to solve the case. In 2022, a really high reward will be offered again for information. 1 million Australian dollars. In 2024, a new inquest will be opened in the Revelle Balmain case. In Australian law, an inquest is a public judicial investigation conducted by a coroner. Its purpose is to clarify the circumstances surrounding a death. This also allows witnesses to be questioned again and evidence to be re-evaluated. And this has now revealed something interesting that was not previously known. A witness now claims to have heard something on the night of November 5th to 6th. First, the screech of car tires, then male voices arguing. This was followed by the shrill scream of a woman's voice. The witness looked in that direction and saw a dark car. It looked as if there were 5 or 6 people in the car. Next to the dark car, another car drove by at exactly the same speed. This statement is so exciting because the witness says something else. The next morning, she walked past the spot where she had seen the cars with her daughter. There they saw skid marks on the asphalt, as well as a washed-out denim skirt and a sandal that looked exactly like Revelle's. This would actually fit in with the theory that Zoran and his 2 friends had something to do with Revelle's disappearance. Unfortunately, this is also the last update in the case. But it is an update. Even after 30 years, there is still movement in the case. And I hope for Revelle's sister and her friends that the case can be solved soon. Revelle's parents assumed that their daughter was no longer alive at the end of the 1990s. They only found out that their daughter had been working as an escort through the police. Jen Balmain once said that Revelle paid the highest possible price for her decision, but we don't believe she didn't deserve justice. And Jen and her husband are right, of course. Revelle definitely deserved justice, no matter what or who led to her death. Maybe the escort business just seemed like a good way to earn some extra money on the side. The following is not a scientific survey, of course, but it is anecdotally interesting. According to a survey by the US magazine Cosmopolitan, 37% of its mostly female readers can imagine working as an escort to pay their bills. While this is only anecdotal, it perhaps illustrates quite well how tempting such a profession can be to young women. Precisely because the basic idea behind escorting is that it doesn't have to be physical. At first glance, it seems like an easy way to earn good money. Perhaps that was also Revelle's thinking. But it's a tough job and one that can quickly become dangerous. Either because you get involved with the wrong people or because you push past the boundaries you set for yourself at the beginning when there's more money to be made. But stigmatizing jobs like this isn't the answer either. And this is definitely not meant to be victim blaming, because the guilt and responsibility for a crime always lies with the perpetrators and not with the victims. But I think it's important to talk about the dangers that come with it, even if you're employed by an agency like Revelle, because it's unfortunately obvious that her job had something to do with her disappearance, regardless of whether you think Gavin or Zoran is the suspect. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the subject and, of course, on the case. Do you think Gavin is the most likely suspect, or do you find the lead on Zoran more promising? And if so, how do you interpret Jane's behavior? I'm curious to hear your theories. By the way, you'll also be supporting the channel. Other than that, there's not much more to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching the video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, bye everyone.